Today's story was written by Reddit user NotPraisedNotABother. Humanity was going out with a bang. "Guns up!" Lorenzo barked as he strolled behind the firing line. In a shuffle of cloth and metal, the 22 men, women and teens raised their rifles, staring hard down their sights at the distant rolling clouds. The unclouded sky was just as grey. No sunlight shone, despite it being the middle of the day. Lorenzo checked everyone's posture twice, going back and forth, occasionally tapping people on the head with his fist and telling them to fix their grip or widen their stance. For all minor adjustments he ordered, however, he didn't have to warn people not to be scared. Fear would make them slow. He couldn't let them be slow when it might cost them and everyone else their lives. But he didn't have to tell them. Everyone here knew. This was it, their last day. "Here it comes!" someone shouted. Lorenzo looked out at the storm and saw its eye had begun to swell and touch down. "Look alive!" He grabbed his own gun and raced to join the end of the line. "Aim for the cockpit and the engines!" The others shouted their affirmative. Lorenzo levelled his gun just as the ships began to tear out of the funneling cloud. They were sleek and shiny, yet strangely inelegant with their bulbous front end and strangely contorted wings. It didn't seem to impede them, however. In seconds they had already halved the distance between them and the ragged human defenders. 1 second, they got closer. 2 seconds, they were almost on top of them. "Now!" Lorenzo screamed, and a hail of bullets roared out to meet the incoming starships. "What do you think you'll do on your last day on Earth?" Marco asked. Lorenzo looked across the table at him. They were sat in an outside dining area in the middle of the city, where people would normally be walking about and enjoying the sunshine, with it being the middle of the day and all. The city was quiet today though, and there were no people around. Most importantly, there was no sunlight, just a grey, overcast day. Lorenzo sat back in his chair and thought a moment. "I don't think about it," he said eventually. Marco shook his head. He was dressed in a striped button-up shirt and beige pants today, his hair a curly mess, but a cultivated one. He'd put effort in today, probably for the first time in months. "Come on," he half grinned. "With everything going on, you haven't thought about it once?" His expectant smile faded as Lorenzo shook his head. "It's not important to me," Lorenzo told his friend. Marco nodded to show he heard. His expression said everything about whether or not he agreed, and looked down at his hands as he picked at his pants. Lorenzo looked off to the side at the nearby canal, taking a drink from the bottle of wine in his hand. Even the water looked grey, but that was probably a reflection of the sky. "Seems weird," Marco said, still looking down, "not to think about it, when a lot of other people didn't get to think about theirs before." He trailed off. Lorenzo took a deep breath and let it go. He looked back at Marco. "I don't think about it," he said, "because I don't think about when I'm going to die, and I don't think about that because it's not important to me." Marco shook his head again, more empathetically this time. "How? How can you not think about it?" He looked up and met Lorenzo's gaze. His eyes were haunted, desperate. "Everything's gone to shit, Enzo. We're all going to die. How—" his voice cracked. "How do you not think about it?" He looked away to regain his composure. Lorenzo let him do so in silence. When his friend had gotten control of himself, he finally answered. "I was always going to die, Marco," Lorenzo said quietly. "Everyone is. And they always have. Nothing about that has changed, just because it's all happening at once around the world." Marco snorted. Lorenzo kept going. "So it's situation normal then," he continued. "I'm going to live until I die, whenever that happens, and until then," he raised his bottle to Marco, I have my friends, and I have time. At least that's my assumption. He grinned, but Marco didn't return it. So why fight? The other man said dully. A wind blew through the narrow street, carrying a chill with it. I know you're planning to resist when they get here. Why not just give up? Let them take you and everyone with them. Just because I'm comfortable with death doesn't mean I want to die, Lorenzo pointed out. And even if I did, I know there's a lot of people who still don't. He lightly kicked at Marco's leg under the table. I'm not willing to leave them alone just so I can feel better. Marco smiled, just a little. So what, you'll just do what you've always done? Doing what you want? Seems short-sighted of you. Yeah, Lorenzo laughed, taking another swig of his wine. But that's what everyone else is doing, right? People want to live. That's why they struggle so much, he chuckled, and eventually Marco joined in. The two men laughed together, a joyous sound ringing in the empty streets of Venice. Marco suddenly grabbed Lorenzo's hand and kissed his knuckles. Lorenzo let him. He'd clearly wanted to do something like that for a while. Please don't die, Marco pleaded. At least, not before me. Lorenzo gave him a roguish grin. Marco, he said, until my last day, I never will. The countryside burned. Wreckage from at least a dozen downed ships littered the once verdant hills, scorched trails left behind where they crashed and rolled. Screams filled the air, only some of them human. Lorenzo stood atop a fallen ship and levelled his gun at the grass beneath his feet. He squeezed the trigger. The pilot died instantly. The human breathed shakily. He popped his magazine out and checked it. He was out, and with 50 more ships flying overhead, he glanced at the gun, then grabbed it around the middle, just below the action. The barrel was hot, so he couldn't grab it there, and where he currently had his grip was awkward, but it would make a serviceable bludgeon. He scanned the area around him. Some bodies, lots of metal, and smoke obscuring his vision. His firing line was scattered now. Probably most were dead. He could still look for survivors, kill a few more of the invaders in the meantime. Lorenzo jumped down from the ship and crouched low as he went, his eyes flicking back and forth. He tried to listen for any of his people, but it was too noisome. He couldn't pick out any particular voices from the very inhuman ones, until he heard one. No, he heard Marco shout, "Stay back! Get away!" A burst of gunfire cracked through the cacophony. He conserved bullets. He always was intelligent. The shouts had come from the left, back towards the village where they'd lined up for their last stand. Lorenzo sprinted there, no longer trying to keep himself out of sight from any potential attackers in the smoke. He skirted around one ball of twisted metal and spotted his friend. Marco was on his back on the grass, scooting away as fast as he could while firing into the invader approaching him. A big bruiser, probably 9 feet tall, with shoulders as wide as a truck and skin as grey as a storm cloud, holding no weapons save for the wicked claws that adorned its 3 long fingers. They were maybe a dozen meters from the village. There'd be shelter there, a good place to hold ground, at least until the invaders broke through. Best of all, the invader's back was to Lorenzo. The human grinned and raced up to his friend and the invader. Marco's eyes widened as he saw him rush in and started to open his mouth, but before he said anything, Lorenzo leapt into the air, maybe 3 or 4 feet off the ground, and smashed his makeshift club into the back of the invader's head as he passed by. The gun shattered against the alien's tough skin. It groaned like the grinding of boulders in a cave, and clutched at the back of its head as Lorenzo landed next to Marco. "Taking this," he said, grabbing Marco's gun from his hand. He pointed at the village. "Go." Marco was in shock, but he shook his head violently. "No, not without—" "Yes." Lorenzo saw a flash of motion out the corner of his eye and threw himself backwards. The invader's claw caught on the back of his shirt and tore it nearly up to the collar, but it didn't touch him. Lorenzo rolled, awkwardly landing on his knees, and brought up his gun to fire in the invader's face. The alien, apparently furious, didn't even flinch. It roared and rushed forward, swiping with its claws. In his current position, Lorenzo couldn't dodge except to throw himself again, this time to the side. The invader's foot caught the tip of his ear, which erupted into burning pain as it tore. He needed to get more hits in. The invaders were tough, but if they resisted enough force, it suddenly started to affect them like anything else, like shock absorbers getting worn or losing their ability to dissipate force, or something like that. Lorenzo didn't know, he just knew he had to hit him hard enough times that they bled. He kept rolling with his momentum until he was able to spin himself upright again, this time catching his feet. Blood trickled down the side of his head where that chunk of ear was pulled off of him. The invader was right behind him. "Come on," he shouted, firing directly into its face again. A chunk of something, a piece of Lorenzo's broken gun, flew through the air and smacked the invader in the back of the head. "Hey!" Marco shouted, already holding another piece of rifle in his hand. "Samaro, fucking come at me!" The invader got confused by the assault from two sides and looked over at Marco. Lorenzo took advantage of its distraction and shot at its head again, twice more. "No!" he shouted, adding to Marco's taunts. "Come get me, Belena! Asino!" He ran around the invader so he was at a 45-degree angle from the alien to Marco. The grey alien roared as another piece of broken rifle hit it in the gut. "Lorenzo!" Marco called over it. "Get over here!" He was clearly terrified, but he stubbornly held his ground as the invader turned toward him with fury on its face. Lorenzo ran, but not to Marco. He interposed himself between his friend and the alien as it began to charge. He screamed wordlessly as he fired round after round in its face, and finally they punched through that ashen grey skin, spilling black blood into its eyes, nose and mouth. The alien moaned and tripped over its feet, turning a charge into a skid across the grass. Lorenzo danced back as it came at him. "Ha ha!" he crowed. He jabbed his gun at the alien's head. "Take that, you!" "Enzo!" Lorenzo turned at Marco's frantic call, and as he did, the alien suddenly whipped its clawed arm out and stabbed all three of its wicked talons through his leg. He cried out in pain, then slammed into the ground as the alien pulled his feet out from under him, using its claws to drag him down. The wind was knocked out of him, and he gasped for air. Marco started shouting, but Lorenzo's ears were ringing and his blood was pounding so loud. He twisted to turn his gun on the invader, but couldn't squeeze the trigger before it jerked him closer and reached out with its other claw. He fired his gun into its face at point blank. It stabbed its other three claws through his gut and tore up his stomach before its death throes began. Lorenzo couldn't move. Every twitch shifted the claws in his abdomen, and every shift set a new blaze of caustic, devouring pain raging through his insides. He could move his neck at least. His head fell back against the ground and tried to breathe as shallowly as possible. The sky was certainly grey, wasn't it? A pounding like drum beats pealed against the ground near his head. Something ripped the gun from his hands, and the sound of a club beating on flesh filled his ears. It stopped, but not before hands grasped his head, and Marco said, as though from a great distance, "Enzo! Lorenzo, can you hear me?" He could. He couldn't see him, though. He could hardly see anything, just grey. Something wet dropped on his face. Was it raining? No, he could hear Marco, crying, saying his name. Marco was crying. Lorenzo didn't like that. He wanted to tell him it would be alright. He didn't have much time, though. Did he have enough words to say what he had to? You know, he whispered, any louder and the wounds in his stomach would burn. This was the perfect way to spend my last day. Hope you live. Lorenzo! He couldn't hear anything else. There was a rushing in his ears, almost like a tidal wave crashing onto the shore. The grey was somehow pulling away, and white filling the spaces on either side, like a tunnel of light. Lorenzo's vision went blank, and he breathed his last.